McCain. The first thing is to get as many reserve planes up to Button, Espiritu Santo, as you can. Cactus, Guadalcanal, cannot handle any more planes right now, but you have to be ready to feed them in all the time. Aviation gasoline supply at Cactus is the present most critical question. They talked of other problems of logistics. Then Nimitz got down to personnel. Nimitz. How is Noyes? McCain. All right, just suffering a little from the blast. Noyes was nearly killed in the torpedoing of the Wasp. Nimitz. How about Fletcher? We are going to give him a blow. Rest on the mainland. McCain. I was going to write you about him, but I didn't. 2 or 3 of these fights are enough for any one man. A rest will do him good. Nimitz. Is there anything else? McCain. I want to emphasize the aviation gas supply and relief for pilots at Cactus. We can fly VF fighters up, but not back. It is a one-way wind. The Marine VF pilots are very tired. A relief for them is there now, and the SBD dive bomber pilots will be next. They have had no rest, they are just tired. They had to work during the day and could get no sleep at night. The Marines are not worried about holding what they have on Cactus, but you have got to stop the Japanese coming in. On these moonlight nights we will try torpedoes, but we haven't many of them. We lost 2 SBDs trying to bomb ships at night. Harmon has been working on a new method for the B-17. He is going to have them come in weaving at low altitude and then straightening out just before the drop. Harmon says a new field of employment for B-17S is necessary because of the big investment in material and personnel that has been put in them. We are developing a new night site. Nimitz. How about the Norden site? Ofsti. It is a high-altitude bomb site for above 6,000 feet. McCain. The B-17 pilots are good. They will come down, but doctrine keeps them up. I saw the pictures of Rakata Bay, where they strafed and destroyed 5 seaplanes on the water. Another one strafed a combatant ship. I saw the pictures, and you could see the Japanese falling right over on the deck. He made 2 passes before the ship fired at him. During the third, they opened up on him, and he left with about 20 or 30 holes in him, but he got back all right. In trying to discover what was wrong with Fletcher, Nimitz had asked McCain to make some inquiries. On his way back to Washington, McCain saw Fletcher at San Diego and did just that. He reported in a letter, "I talked with Fletcher. He said he was very concerned and very apprehensive as to the location and character of service of his task group, both before the hit, Saratoga, and until arrival at Pearl. Also very tired. He added that he was in good shape and rested now, and after a little leave would be ready to go in again. He did appear to be in good shape, except for a slightly strained expression about the eyes, which you have become so accustomed to seeing in the eyes of others returning from active operations. I told him that he should not ask to go on another detail unless he felt at his best, that he owed that both to himself and to the job. He thought this over for a while and said, "You are right, I will take as long a leave as I can get, and if I feel my best will ask to go again, and I am sure I will." I feel he should be taken at his word. So Fletcher was to have a blow. For how long would depend on what King saw and what King thought in those 2 weeks of temporary duty in Washington, for that was why Fletcher was being ordered back. Somehow he seemed to be the unluckiest of admirals. He had participated in more major operations than any other carrier admiral, although he was not an aviator. Every one of them except Midway had gone a little sour. And in the case of Midway, Spruance came out with the glory. McCain also had a sense of humour, which he revealed in the next paragraph of his letter to Nimitz. I talked with Admiral King by telephone and asked him to find 50 high-altitude VF fighters and put them on board ship bound for the south right away. He yelled into the phone, "That's your business. That is why I brought you back." If he meant that, which I doubt, I will surely get them. My very best to you. It was a friendly little ending. They both knew their commander-in-chief, whose propensity for shouting transcended main navy. For King, stern taskmaster with himself, was equally stern with all about him. Indeed, it was said around main navy yard that you always knew when you were doing a good job if you worked for King because he only grunted at you. On his way south, then, Nimitz knew that one of his problems was solved. Fletcher would not be back soon, which opened a nice big hole for Halsey to step into with no complications. It was enough to make a commander-in-chief sigh with relief. On September 28th, Nimitz was aboard Gormley's flagship, the USS Argonne, in Noumea Harbour. With Nimitz were Captain Ofstie, his aviation officer, and Colonel Pfeiffer, his marine officer. Gormley was present with Captain Callahan, his chief of staff, and Turner was there. So were Generals Arnold, Harmon, Sutherland, Street, and Kenny, representing various aspects of the Army, from MacArthur to the Air Corps. Nimitz opened the meeting. The purpose of my visit is to inform myself and members of my staff with conditions in the SOPAC area, and to inform myself on the problems of Admiral Gormley and General MacArthur. We will begin the conference by having Gormley or Harmon outline the situation in this area. Gormley. As you know, we are now occupying the Cactus and Ringbolt area, Guadalcanal and Tulagi, with one division plus a regiment. On Cactus, we are holding only a small area, which Turner or Harmon can describe for you. Our forces and position there is under constant pressure. Logistics supply is most difficult. We can send in only one ship at a time, and from the eastward there is only one channel. Most of the Japanese in the area are on Cactus, but Vandergrift reports that most of those previously to the east and south are now gone. By recent report, he has surrounded a group to the westward, but he has not yet reported how many he has caught in his bag. The Japanese are still getting in despite our air activity. Nobody knows exactly how many are on Cactus right now. We have lost 3 APDs, converted destroyer transports, and one, the Stringham, has to go to the yard. We have no craft for raids on enemy positions since we lost those APDs. At Ringbolt, Tulagi, there have been no enemy raids, but there have been several bombings and bombardments. Our dive bombing against enemy night attacks by surface vessels has not been successful. There is a tricky 45-knot wind, and although our aircraft have turned back their destroyers on some nights, no hits have been made. One AK, naval cargo vessel, can go into Ringbolt Harbour, but the Japanese know the area perfectly and are able to bombard from close to the foul area. One time they had only 10,000 gallons of aviation gas left. McCain sent in a tender with aviation gasoline. One ship could spend only 6 hours unloading in the 2 days it was there. The rest of the time it was dodging bombers. So it went, Nimitz asking his pointed questions and not stopping until he got answers. There was another meeting on October 2nd, concerned first with amphibious operations. In the interim, Dremel had been sent back from San Diego to Washington for temporary duty with King, and he had been sent to the 4th Naval District in Philadelphia. For all practical purposes, the Pacific Fleet Amphibious Force was dissolved, left in the hands of a captain on Dremel's staff. In October, Admiral Turner proposed to establish an amphibious training group in the Southwest Pacific area. Nimitz told his admirals what he wanted: all-weather airfields, plenty of storage for aviation gas, good housing for pilots, Quonset huts, not tents. He addressed himself to Gormley. "I want you to go up and see conditions for yourself. Callahan can take care of things here while you are away. I am going to ask Holcomb to go up there, and I want you to go up there not later than the time he does." He snapped out more directions: improve cargo handling facilities, complete all-weather roads, provide good repair services for planes. Planes are too expensive and too hard to get to let only minor damage render them permanently unserviceable. At Guadalcanal, Turner was to have at least 2 heavy ships, bow and stern moorings, with nets around them for torpedo protection. They would also move PT boats into the area. He wanted a salvage tub in the area. He wanted good communications, and he would send Captain John Redman, Zinc Pack Communications Officer, to help put it in. Nimitz said he wanted to talk about the future after consolidation in the Solomons. Originally, the operations plan had called for the building of airfields on adjacent islands and consolidation of port facilities, but Nimitz and King had junked the old Task 2 and Task 3 and were reworking the operational plan. But first, Nimitz said, Colonel Pfeiffer had some matters to take up. Pfeiffer spoke about the need for labour battalions for Guadalcanal. Turner did not want to use CBs, men of the construction battalions. Nimitz asked if they could get natives from Leyte. Gormley said it sounded like blackbirding. Nimitz asked if the army had labour battalions. Pfeiffer said yes, and Pfeiffer and Turner went off into a technical discussion about getting and using labour. Nimitz put a stop to it. That is enough discussion on that question. We must get our own labour battalions out here. I think we can get some good material down south. Pfeiffer. The next question is to reduce the weight of landing mat bundles from 5,000 to 2,000 pounds. Turner. The only way to do that is to have it done in the States where they are first bundled. To repack here would take too much time and labour and would ruin lots of mat. Arnold said he would arrange that. Nimitz. Perhaps we should remind him of it. What else do you have, Pfeiffer? They went on to discuss radio and coast watchers, unloading procedures, and IFF equipment. Captain Ofsty said the problem was to get the technicians to keep the IFF equipment operable. Nimitz Hormley, you tell Harmon to get the necessary qualified personnel out to the bases. Next question was the mail, Pfeiffer said. Nimitz EEs, that is an important and serious question. If we can get mail to the men, it boosts morale. What is the situation? The problem was maintaining secrecy about ship movements. Nimitz. I realize the need for secrecy of ship movements. I suggest you get one man from each ship and have him look out for his ship's mail. He will find out how to get it to his ship, or they will find out why. Every ship can afford one man for this important duty. Ofsty, you look into the mail situation further and let me know what should be done. They talked about Gormley's communications officer. Gormley said he was fine. Nimitz indicated he thought the officer was a technician and not a man of broad view. Gormley was stubbornly loyal to his officer. Turner broke in to say he certainly wanted an experienced communications officer on his staff, and asked Nimitz to send him one, which made Gormley look foolish, since Nimitz had earlier indicated that Gormley's man was inexperienced. The others began a technical discussion of fuel and storage, so-called spooner projects about which we know little. Nimitz. Those are details I can't and don't intend to settle. I want now to hear about future operations. Gormley, first we must get Cactus stabilized. That will be a big job and will take time. Then we are going to occupy Ndeni, where we will build airfields. That will extend our search 325 miles and will be a great help. We are now going into the Ellis Group at Funafuti. The next step will be to Rabaul. How this is to be done is an open question. MacArthur wants to take a lot of airfields and bomb out Rabaul. I think he should go ahead and clean out New Guinea first. He has not filled in for us his plan for getting from his present position to Rabaul. We have to neutralize the Solomons. We have to go up that chain of islands. If the Japanese make a maximum effort there, we can't stop them. The purpose of the Japanese going into the Gilberts, I first did not know whether it was for the offensive or the defensive. I now think it was for a defensive purpose. They might try to make a diversion for us down here by going against Hawaii. I think they have in the Rabaul area from 15,000 to 60,000 troops. Turner, 5 divisions. Gormley was miring himself deeper and deeper as the conversation continued. He had accepted MacArthur's estimate, which Nimitz refused. He was indicating defeatism, which Nimitz could near bear. He did not have such details as the realistic appraisal of the Japanese situation. Turner did. Gormley. A Japanese division has about 15,000 men, so that would make about 75,000 there. In Bougainville they have many troops at both ends of the island, but I don't know exactly how many. Nimitz. How many ships does it take to move a Japanese division? Turner. About 2/3 of what it takes us. Gormley. I think they would use large landing boats to make a move against Cactus. If they use larger ships, Turner's estimate of 2/3 of ours is about correct. Nimitz. But their movements by small boats have not been successful. Deeper and deeper and deeper. Turner, obviously trying to pull Gormley out of it. They lost about 20%, but they are still fighting offensively on Cactus. Nimitz. I know that, but they still have the momentum of unchecked offensive. They have the morale, and they have the bases from which to operate. Turner now began to speak very strongly and forthrightly to his fleet commander. They are better trained. Nimitz. Yes, but there certainly are reasons why they have not come against Cactus in greater strength. Turner. I haven't changed my mind since what I told you when I saw you in San Francisco at the Summer King Nimitz conference. I said then that Guadalcanal could be easily taken, but that it would be costly. It has been costly. We have not made further progress on Cactus due to our ignorance and lack of skill. The previous schemes were to pull the Marines and go ahead. But they only have a 5-mile square area now. The troops there have to clean up the place and extend their lines so we can get another airfield area. They want relief by the army and to go back for reorganization, rest and replacements. I want enough forces there, and light forces and more iron to throw out the Japanese. I want to get another trained outfit with boats, to build up the air strength and to go ahead with new troops. We can't go ahead with a single line because it could be too easily cut off. We must have supporting positions to keep it going. We must have the situation in hand at Cactus to use it for a springboard. The Marines now there must stay there. They are veterans and a valuable force. We must get our other forces trained. Many of our losses came from lack of training. Nimitz asked about the army forces coming. It would be the 43rd Division, but except for one regimental combat team that was ready, the others were going to Auckland for training. Gormley asked about Patch's troops, but Gormley said only one regiment was trained for combat. Nimitz asked Gormley if he had authority to move army troops where he wanted, and Gormley said he would take that authority, the first statement he had made of which Nimitz thoroughly approved. But when Nimitz asked about New Zealand troops, Gormley bogged down in a discussion about the problems. Nimitz. If we can't find a formula for using them, it is Japan's gain. We should use all resources that are available to us. Gormley was not sure that all the leadership of New Zealand was agreed to fight under American control. Nimitz. Well, let's get it into the record. Ask them, and if they refuse, it will be in the record for the peace conference. They know that. We must overcome the obstacles in the way of how and where to employ them. Gormley was not sure the New Zealanders were well enough trained to hold. Well, don't put them in a place where they can lose the war for us. But there must be some place where we can use them. However, that is a detail I won't go into. That is your job to find out. I repeat again that to win this war, we must use every resource we have. I agree that no change is to be made in the troops at Cactus until the position there is secure. No other thought has ever been in my mind. I have a high regard for the Marines up there, and I can't agree that they are so inexperienced. They have handled everything the Japanese had. Now they are not able to spread their influence very far because of lack of means of communications such as road and trails to move troops and tanks. They have to cut roads through the jungle to move their tanks. Asked about the raiders. The raiders and the parachute troops of the 1st Division are shot. They will have to come out to rebuild. I am against the use of the 2nd raiders on Guadalcanal. Well, you see about using New Zealand and army troops. Broke in to discuss a dispatch he had received in August from King, speaking for the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The Joint Chiefs had wanted Gormley to supply a plan and schedule for further operations against the Japanese south and east of Rabaul. Gormley had not answered. I feel that our present operations have not yet reached a point where such plan and schedule would be worthwhile, he said. Asked Ofstie what he knew, and Ofstie had a proposed directive on the subject for issue by SINCPAC. We can't consider that proposal in the 5 minutes we have left. Ofstie, give Gormley a copy of the proposal, and Gormley, you send us your comments and recommendations on it. I repeat again, if we can't use our allies, we are goddamned fools. Nimitz returned tired and troubled from the South Pacific. The 12-day trip had been grueling in many ways. They had left Pearl Harbor on Thursday, September 24th, in a Coronado flying boat. One engine of the plane had failed, and after they limped into Palmyra, the plane was sent back to Pearl, and another was substituted for the next leg of the trip. They had flown to Canton Island on Saturday, September 26th, and Nimitz had inspected the installations and conferred with the British resident. There were meetings as described, especially that of September 28th, when they flew to Noumea, where the vital meeting with Gormley had lasted from 16:15 in the afternoon until 20:15 that night. On Tuesday, Nimitz had inspected the facilities in the Noumea area along with Major General Patch, the commander of the army forces in New Caledonia, and others. He had visited the Ilnu Naval Air Base. Rear Admiral Murray, commander of Task Force 17, had called. Nimitz had made a presentation of the Navy Cross to Admiral Turner, and at 13:20 in the afternoon had flown to Espiritu Santo, arriving at 1700. There he had talked to Admiral Fitch and given out medals, a Distinguished Service Medal to Fitch, 2 Navy Crosses to Marines, 2 Distinguished Flying Crosses for naval pilots. Next day there was another inspection trip, and then the party went to the Army airfield. A young captain met them there, and discovered that he was to take this distinguished party to Guadalcanal. He did not know there was a 4-star admiral in the area, for the security of Nimitz's trip had been carefully maintained. They took off in a B-17 at about 16:30 that afternoon. An hour out, the plane encountered heavy weather, and soon the pilot admitted he was quite lost, was riding up front with the aircrew. He went back to find Lieutenant Commander Lamar, because he remembered that Lamar, a born aide, had brought along a National Geographic map of the South Pacific. Lamar dug into his bag and found it, and with this guide, Ofstie navigated the B-17 into Henderson Field. That night, a rather shaken party spent the evening with General Vandergrift and his officers. At 0630 the next morning, Nimitz was up and about, awarding medals at an assembly in the bamboo grove in front of Vandergrift's quarters. Navy Crosses were awarded to Vandergrift, General Rupertus, Colonel Edson, and Lieutenant Colonel Carlson of the Raiders, and 3 young Marine officers, including Marion Carl, the pilot. Then came the moment when Nimitz gave a Navy Cross to a hulking sergeant, who might have weighed 250 pounds. Lamar read the citation for bravery, far beyond the call of duty, and Nimitz reached up to pin on the medal, whereupon the sergeant fell over in a dead faint. Vandergrift was very upset. When the Marine came to, he said he was sorry, but he had never seen a 4-star admiral before, and he was scared to death. Nimitz was the Jonah again. Trying to take off from Guadalcanal, the big plane skidded and slid to the end of the runway. Nimitz and party were forced to wait several hours until the part of the field not covered by mast and netting dried out. Obviously, first-hand experience caused him next day to start talking about the need for all-weather airfields. The Nimitz party was further delayed that day when a coast watcher on another island reported Japanese bombers heading their way. The bombers never arrived, but Nimitz took the extra hour to go forward and visit the marine lines, and finally got away at 1300, returning to Espiritu Santo, where he presented another Navy Cross to Major James Roosevelt of Carlson's Raiders. The next day he flew back to Noumea for what became the fateful talk with Gormley, then on October 3rd went to Fiji, Suva, making aerial reconnaissance of the Nandi area, and later of Wallis and Hull Islands. He was back in Pearl Harbor at noon on October 5th, Monday, and at his desk. Nimitz was troubled because he was worried about morale in the South Pacific, and particularly about Gormley, who seemed to Nimitz to be unable to face the obstacles and enemy strength. But worried as he was about Gormley's performance, Nimitz hoped for the best. He had indicated to Gormley what he must do, and in his thoughtful way he was rooting for the man to do it. On October 8th he sent Captain Redmond to the South Pacific, bearing a letter to Gormley. Halsey, accompanied by Admiral Calhoun, the Service Force commander, and Spruance, would be coming down to Noumea, he said. Halsey would visit the area first, and then join Task Force 16 as commander, and also as Senior Pacific Fleet Task Force commander in the area. Halsey, Nimitz said, would be subject to Gormley's operational control as long as he was in the South Pacific. Kincaid was to relieve Murray in command of Task Force 16, and new captains would be coming for other ships. Fletcher was supposed to come back in November with Task Force 11, but if he did not, then Frederick Sherman would take the task force. Nimitz spoke a little bit about ships and task force deployment, gently critical of Murray, who was staying too far away from Guadalcanal to take advantage of opportunities in the Solomons. He also wanted the battleship Washington moved closer to the fighting area, and he disapproved of the plan of keeping another task force south and southeast of Guadalcanal, too far away. He wanted this force moved west and south of Cape Esperance, which might be open to air attack, but he wanted Gormley to accept the risk so he could strike the enemy. Gormley had indicated that he would reinforce Guadalcanal with an army regiment, and Nimitz approved. He was not sure King would approve of his, Nimitz's, advice. King might think Nimitz too reckless, so he sent a copy of the letter to King. He promised Gormley every assistance, urged him to visit Guadalcanal, which he had not done, and see for himself. "In closing," Nimitz said, "let me again urge you to take such calculated risks as may be warranted in order to continue the attrition which we are now inflicting on the enemy's sea and air force." Nimitz was very understanding of Gormley's problems. He said he was pleased with the accord between Army, Navy and Marines in the area, and he cautioned Gormley to do everything possible to maintain the accord. Tempers worn thin by fatigue and loss of sleep break out easily. Patience and tolerance on the part of all hands will help preserve that unity of purpose and goodwill that is so essential to success. But Nimitz was not soft. The steel fist was there in the velvet glove. "I wish you to include in your final report on the Savo Island Battle of 8 to the 9th of August your opinion as to the responsibility for the dispositions and actions of that night. Such a blow cannot be passed over, and we owe it to the country to do our best to fix the responsibility for that disaster, and to take the action necessary to prevent a recurrence." Which, in simple English, meant that some head was going to roll. On October 11th, Admiral Scott was patrolling not far from Cape Esperance, with orders from Gormley to seek offensive action against the enemy. Nimitz's letter had apparently reached home. That night, Scott engaged the Japanese in the Battle of Cape Esperance. The Americans lost the destroyer Duncan, the cruiser Boise was badly damaged, and the Salt Lake City was damaged. The Japanese lost the heavy cruiser Furutaka and the destroyer Fubuki, and 2 more destroyers were sunk the next day. The cruiser Ioba was badly hit, and the commander of the Japanese force, Admiral Goto, was mortally wounded. The victory was excellent for American morale, but it did not prevent the Japanese from achieving their end. The Japanese force was escorting ships loaded with troops and guns to throw at the Marines in the Solomons. 2 days later, the Japanese began their monthly attempt to recapture Guadalcanal. It opened with bombardment of Henderson Field by the battleships Congo and Haruna, knocking out 48 of the 90 American planes on the field. On October 14th, the Japanese sent 6 transports down the slot, escorted by destroyers and fighter planes, and they unloaded in the full light of the next day, while nothing could be done for several hours until gas was found, even by siphoning it out of B-17S on the island, and fighters managed to destroy 3 of the transports and drive the others away. By October 15th, Nimitz had this to say: "It now appears that we are unable to control the sea in the Guadalcanal area. Thus our supply of the position will only be done at great expense to us. The situation is not hopeless, but it is certainly critical." The next day, even that old optimist Secretary Knox was not sure the Americans could hold on, and said so to a reporter from the New York Times. The trouble was that the problems were just not being solved, and Nimitz had the feeling that time was running out. On October 15th, he conferred with various members of his staff on the question of Gormley. They believed, and he did too, that Gormley was simply not aggressive enough. Nimitz sent King a dispatch asking for permission to relieve Gormley, and received permission that night. Next morning he made the decision, and on October 18th, when Admiral Halsey arrived at Noumea to look over the area where he expected to operate a task force, he was suddenly informed that he was taking over the whole South Pacific. Halsey had flown to Noumea, accompanied by Captain Miles Browning, his chief of staff, and Colonel Julian Brown of the Marine Corps, his intelligence officer. The plane settled down on Noumea harbour at 1400, and a whaleboat came alongside. Halsey stepped aboard, and an officer handed him a sealed envelope. Halsey opened it. Inside was another sealed envelope marked secret, and inside that were his orders. "Jesus Christ and General Jackson!" Halsey exclaimed. "This is the hottest potato they ever handed me." In a way, the choice of Halsey to command the South Pacific seemed odd, for he was known in the fleet as a hard-fighting, hard-playing, devil-may-care commander who was at his best under conditions that another admiral might have called desperate. Halsey was a Navy man from a seagoing family of at least 5 generations, starting with Captain Eliphalet Halsey, who sailed the first Sag Harbor whaler around Cape Horn. Halsey's father had entered the United States Naval Academy in 1869 and retired finally with the rank of captain. His son, William F. Halsey, Jr., was a member of the class of 1904 at the Academy, a year ahead of Nimitz. This class was also the class of Kimmel and David Bagley, 2 other distinguished Navy men. Halsey was very active in Academy life and stood about the middle of his class academically, which indicated his personality and interests. He held more class offices before he was finished than any but one other man, and he was, without a doubt, the most popular man in the class. "A real old salt, looks like a figurehead of Neptune, everybody's friend." So the class yearbook described him. As an ensign, he served on the battleship Kansas when she went on the famous round-the-world cruise as one of 21 ships of the Great White Fleet. He was promoted very quickly to full lieutenant, and then spent most of the next 23 years in torpedo boats and destroyers. A real old salt indeed. But in those 23 years there were other experiences, a hitch in naval intelligence in Washington, and another in the sensitive post of naval attaché to the American Embassy in Berlin. He had been commander of the receiving ship Reina Mercedes at the Naval Academy, and when that ship was made headquarters for the little aviation detachment at Annapolis, Halsey became an aviation enthusiast. In the spring of 1930, Admiral Richardson, then chief of the Bureau of Navigation, had learned of Halsey's interest and offered him a chance at flight training. But Halsey could not pass the physical examination. Instead, he went to the Naval War College at Newport and the next year to the Army War College at Washington. At the one institution, Halsey studied naval campaigns. At the other, he studied high strategy of wars. And then, in 1934, Admiral King, who was chief of the Bureau of Aeronautics, offered Halsey command of the carrier Saratoga if he would take the Aviation Observer's course at Pensacola. Halsey was then 51 years old. Halsey did better than that. He took the pilot's course, having sneaked in under the wire in another guise. The stratagem worked, and somehow, without passing the physical examination, Halsey was qualified as a pilot. How good a pilot? Well, his instructor, later Admiral Bromfield Nicholl, recalled the mysteries of Halsey's flying. The worse the weather, the better he flew. But he could fly, and he did fly. After 2 years in Saratoga, Halsey was made commander of the Pensacola School and Base. He was made Rear Admiral in 1936, and 2 years later became commander of Carrier Division II, which included the carriers Yorktown and Enterprise. Then and later in command of Carrier Division I, Halsey was instrumental in the development of carrier techniques. One, for example, was the use of a single wavelength for all scout planes of a carrier force, so that all carriers would be told when the enemy was sighted. When war came, he had been in charge of Task Force 2, when he split off from Milo Dremel, calling his carrier Enterprise, 3 cruisers, and 9 destroyers Task Force 8. Halsey had been sent with this force to support the Wake Relief operation, and he never did learn why the task was called off. But then came the Marshall's Raid, and Halsey was in the thick of the war. From the beginning of the war, Halsey had endeared himself to the men of his task force and to the sailors of the whole fleet by his flamboyant gestures. On the last day of January 1942, Halsey was fueling Enterprise, preparatory to the attack on the Marshalls, when a Japanese patrol plane came by. He watched on the radar screen as the blip closed on the force, then moved away without sending an alarm. Immediately, Halsey called his Japanese language officer and prepared a message of defiance. From the American admiral in charge of the striking force to the Japanese admiral on the Marshall Islands, it is a pleasure to thank you for having your patrol plane not sight my force. Next day, planes from the Enterprise dropped copies of this leaflet on the islands, and of course the men who prepared, printed and delivered it spread the word throughout the fleet. Halsey was the fighting admiral. He was the one chosen to lead the carriers Enterprise and Hornet on the ticklish and dangerous Tokyo raid. He came back to Pearl Harbor just too late to make the Battle of the Coral Sea, and then returned sick with nervous dermatitis to go into the hospital. Now he had been handed what he called the hot potato of the Pacific War. There was little doubt about the difficulties ahead. Back in Pearl Harbor, Nimitz was preparing for action. He wanted Kinkaid to relieve Murray in Task Force 17 and Frederick Sherman to command another task force. He would have Fletcher back if Fletcher was ready, in all respects, to return to sea. "If you feel that Fletcher needs a longer period of rest," he wrote King, "I suggest that he be trained ashore in some capacity." Lee Noyes was holding the fort for Towers as commander of aircraft in the Pacific, but would then be a spare flag officer, and Nimitz suggested Noyes might be sent elsewhere since he would have C.P. Mason and DeWitt Ramsey as spare flag officers. In the South Pacific, the coming of Halsey was greeted on the decks of the ships and in the mud of Guadalcanal with cheers. Now, said the Americans fighting there, they would go someplace. What Halsey did was bring a new morale to dispirited men, and immediately he began to change the atmosphere from the grey of defeatism to the brightness of hope. The change was electric. "I early placed emphasis on the principle of unity of command," he said. "I insisted that each commander of a task force must have full authority over all components of his force, regardless of service or nationality. I believe the wholehearted efforts of all hands to create one South Pacific fighting team prove the key to success in overcoming the many obstacles in the conduct of later operations involving the use of task forces of varied composition." He set about establishing relations with MacArthur in the south, and with Admiral Thierry d'Argenlieu, the French governor, up on the hill of Noumea. There was much difficulty with the French because the New Caledonian colonials were divided between adherents to Vichy and de Gaulle insisted that the French forces on the island retain their independence and aloofness. There was, after all, a strange relationship between France and Japan that affected Indochina, where the Japanese were garrisoned but the French still ruled in theory. Except for some matters concerning supply and housing, however, the French of New Caledonia were only an irritant or social companions. Halsey set up shop in the Japanese consulate and began building confidence. Part of his formula, though not exactly good copy, was the principle of a bottle of Scotch on the table always bore fruit in our dealings with other commands. It was not just the whisky. Halsey charmed his guests, and soon after beginning to listen, they learned that he knew what he was talking about. Halsey had never considered this type of command for himself. In the winter of 1941, when Admiral Nimitz in the Bureau of Navigation had written him about his next assignment and asked how he would like to command the Norfolk Navy Yard, Halsey had replied that he was completely sceptical about his ability to handle an industrial establishment. What he wanted was a sea command. Now he had everything: diplomatic relations, inter-service relations, supply stations, repair stations, camps, clubs, hospitals, an entire military establishment. All this was thrown on Halsey on October 18th. 2 days later, Nimitz was writing new instructions. He intended to send to the South Pacific for each carrier 1 battleship, 2 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, 1 anti-aircraft cruiser, and a full squadron of destroyers, Nimitz said. But Halsey could use these forces otherwise. Nimitz suggested the employment of 2 carriers and 4 anti-aircraft cruisers in 1 force. 2 days after that, Nimitz was writing again, asking for reports on the loss of the destroyer Meredith on October 15th, and the failure of the Portland and the Porter to complete destruction of Japanese forces they encountered in actions of October 15th and 22. Nimitz wanted to be sure that Halsey was fighting. There was a feeling in the Navy Department that commands and commanders must be very carefully looked over. "I am tremendously pleased over the results of your quick trip of inspection to the Solomons area," Secretary Knox wrote Nimitz. He went on, "While I have the highest possible regard for Admiral Gormley, I had repeated reports of his physical condition, which gave me a great deal of anxiety, and I am satisfied that you acted most wisely and with the most admirable initiative in ordering Halsey to relieve him. It was most unfortunate that the brilliant success which attended the initiation of the Solomon's Island expedition was followed by a period of what, at this distance, looked like indecision in employing the forces at our disposal, and the complete lack of offensive use of our surface craft until Norman Scott's very successful raid north of Savo Island. Knox said he knew one could not gauge an officer's battle competence and personal courage until he had been tested. He could understand the feeling of fair play that would prompt Nimitz or others to give an untried man a chance. But, said the Secretary, in a war on so vast a scale as this, and with such vital issues concerned, just treatment of an individual must yield to higher considerations, even at the expense of doing what may appear to be an injustice. Men of the aggressive fighting type must be preferred over men of more judicial, thoughtful, but less aggressive characteristics. Knox recalled Lincoln's problems in the Civil War. I presume most of us, if we had been required to choose at the beginning of the war between the brilliant, polished, socially attractive McClellan and the rough, rather uncouth, unsocial Grant, would have chosen McClellan just as Lincoln did. But the mistake was not to be repeated. So the lineup was being changed in many places. Pye was relieved as commander of the battleships, Task Force 1, and appointed president of the Naval War College. Here his celebrated strategical abilities could be used fully, without any nagging doubts as to his aggressiveness. Training of future admirals was still a very important part of the Navy mission. Vice Admiral Leary was called back to the Pacific Fleet from his job with MacArthur to take over Task Force 1. Admiral Carpenter replaced Leary. Gormley showed up in Pearl Harbor, very upset about the manner in which he had been relieved, and Nimitz had to tell Gormley very frankly that he was not the man for the job at the time. It was some, if little, solace to Gormley that Nimitz interceded and secured his appointment as commander of the 14th Naval District in Hawaii. He, at least, did not go to Siberia. Frank Jack Fletcher had hoped to come back to sea, but after his leave he did not pass muster with King, so instead of returning to task force duty, he went to Seattle, where he would be commandant of the 13th Naval District. It was not quite so much of a Shanghaiing as in the cases of Dremel and Brown, although his duties were similar. Fletcher's duties also included command of the northwestern sea frontier, which meant an active defense job against possible Japanese attack. Yet it was a come-down for a man who had been thick in the action and hard for Fletcher to take. Brown was later able to solve his problem, in part by securing a third term of duty as naval aide to the President of the United States. At the White House, he would run the map room and keep President Roosevelt informed about the progress of the Pacific War, with the prescience of one who had held a command post at the beginning of the conflict. To the front came the fighting men, and leader of them all was Halsey. Later, the British Royal Navy's liaison officer, Commander Harold Hopkins, went to visit Halsey one day when he was ashore. He came at about sundown and found Halsey sitting on a veranda in shorts, a khaki shirt without insignia, and no stockings. Halsey mixed a drink for his guest and sat and swatted mosquitoes as they talked, yarning for half an hour. I remember thinking that he might well have been a parson, a jolly one, an old-time farmer, or Long John Silver. But when I left him and thought of what he had said, I realized that I had been listening to one of the great admirals of the war. Halsey had arrived just as the Japanese were mounting their mid-monthly attempt to recapture Guadalcanal. On the night of October 20th, he held a meeting aboard the Argonne. Vandergrift came up, as did Major General Patch, the Army commander, and Major General Harmon, the senior Army officer in the South Pacific. Vandergrift and Harmon told of their difficulties. "Are we going to evacuate or hold?" Halsey asked. The generals said they would hold if they got enough help. Kelly Turner said the Navy was doing all it could. Halsey told the generals to go on back, and he promised them every resource he had available. Then Halsey made two quick decisions. He called off the building of an airfield at Endeni in the Santa Cruz Islands and diverted the troops being sent there to Guadalcanal to shore up the defences. Then he ordered an airfield built at Aola Bay on Guadalcanal, and ran smack into the flat opposition of Aubrey Fitch and Marine General Roy Geiger, who had been in the area and knew the territory was totally unsuited. As a result, the 2nd Marine Raider Battalion was marooned, went overland, and ended up making a 30-day march behind the Japanese lines, which resulted in a brilliant victory. A successful admiral had to have luck, in addition to everything else, and Halsey had it. Even his mistakes turned out well. The Japanese were growing restive. Admiral Yamamoto was in the area with 4 carriers, 5 battleships, 14 cruisers, and 44 destroyers, to Halsey's 2 carriers, 2 battleships, 9 cruisers, and 24 destroyers. Kinkaid had Task Force 16 with the Enterprise. Murray had Task Force 17 with the Hornet. Rear Admiral W.A. Lee had Task Force 64, a group of battleships and cruisers. On October 24th, Halsey sent the 2 carrier groups on a sweep north of the Santa Cruz Islands, thence to move southwest, to be able to intercept the Japanese if they tried to approach Guadalcanal. This they were almost certain to do, for on the island the Japanese land forces were making another desperate attempt to capture Henderson Field, the disputed airfield. Early on the morning of October 26th, Admiral Halsey noted from the dispatch stack that patrol planes were in contact with an enemy force about 200 miles northwest of the Hornet. He ordered Admiral Murray to attack, and at the same time Admiral Kinkaid's men were coming into contact with the enemy. A pair of planes from the Enterprise hit the Japanese carrier Zuiho, damaging her seriously and putting her flight deck out of action. Her planes had already flown off, but they could not come back. Hornet was hit that morning by bombs, torpedoes, and a suicide plane crashed by the Japanese squadron commander. Before 0930, she was dead in the water. Her planes closed on the Japanese and smashed carrier Shokaku so that she was put out of the war for 9 months, and the cruiser Chikuma was also put out of action temporarily. Trying to pick up an aircrew, the destroyer Porter was sunk. Then Enterprise was hit, and so was the battleship South Dakota. Hornet was abandoned and finally sunk by the Japanese. The battleship Washington was very nearly sunk by another Japanese submarine. Nimitz had been ready for some such news. On October 22nd, he had suggested that major elements of the Japanese fleet were in the Solomons area, and that they might be expected to attack with superior force any time in the next few weeks, when they would be stronger than the Americans. Having inferior forces, we must count heavily on attrition, but losing no chance to come to grips with the enemy under the principle of calculated risk. By October 31st, the situation in the South Pacific was still cloudy to Nimitz and his men, but that day Halsey was writing to his chief to explain. Halsey was anything but downhearted. He promised Nimitz that, "It will be my utmost endeavour to patch up what we have and go with them. In other words, I will not send any ship back to Pearl Harbor unless it is absolutely necessary." He hoped to get the Enterprise back in action. He knew he could repair the South Dakota locally. Without a whimper, Halsey took the responsibility for one poor aspect of the American show, the fighter control of the carriers. He had brought the communications officer of the Enterprise to his headquarters to be a member of the staff, and since the head of the fighter director school was on the Enterprise, he had not felt badly about it. But in his letter to Nimitz, he offered the facts and took the responsibility. Halsey paused for a moment to bring Nimitz up to date on strategy. "As you may well imagine, I was completely taken aback when I received your orders on my arrival here. I took over a strange job with a strange staff, and I had to begin throwing punches almost immediately. As a consequence, quick decisions had to be made. Since the action, I have about reached the conclusion that the yellow bastards have been playing us for suckers. Their pattern of attack has been practically the same on the 4 occasions they have come down. The scouting force of submarines probably on the surface, backed up by cruisers and possibly battleships, and behind that their carriers, 2 together, and one separated some 40 or 50 miles with accompanying battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. These are placed generally to the northward of the Santa Cruz Islands. To the westward and generally to the northward of the Solomons Guadalcanal area, their covering force. With the transports again to the westward of this force, I think they have sucked us out beyond the easy reach of our shore-based aircraft and are willing to play attrition tactics with us. Halsey had several ideas. The question of keeping battleships and carriers continuously at sea in the submarine-infested waters I believe to be a mistake. He intended to use his heavy ships more sparingly, and he doubted if a battleship or cruiser surprise attack of the kind made by Norman Scott would be made again, but if he had a chance, he assured Nimitz he would certainly take it. The big problem, as both admirals knew, was logistics. There was practically no fuel at Noumea. We need tankers and more tankers and more tankers. He needed repair ships and men who could repair. The biggest and best thing is the army. They have made available to us various mechanics, electricians and welders, and I would like to see it widely advertised that the army is helping us here. I have never seen anything like the spirit there is in this neck of the woods. It is a real United States service. It was a long letter, 8 single-spaced typewritten pages, and it discussed many aspects of the war. Halsey had spoken to Captain Christie, second in command of the submarine force in the area, and they were going to cover Iron Bottom Sound to catch the Japanese coming down with the Tokyo Express. I trust this may help him in securing more monkey meat. We are in need of everything we can get, planes, ships, escort vessels, men, and so on ad nauseam. You are well aware of our needs, and this is not offered in complaint or as an excuse, but just to keep the pot boiling. We are not in the least downhearted or upset by our difficulties, but obsessed with one idea only, to kill the yellow bastards, and we shall do it. My admiration for the officers and men of all the services down here who are doing the actual fighting is beyond all expression. They are superb. We are going to continue to give them hell. He closed, for the plane was due to leave early the next day, and of course such a revealing letter could only be sent by special courier. He promised, however, to write home once a week. Assessing the American situation in the Solomons on the 1st of November, Nimitz's staff found that the pressure there was doing what King had wanted, stopping the Japanese and keeping them from undertaking any other sizable operations. At Pearl Harbor, the command was under no illusions. The Japanese would continue to try to capture Guadalcanal until they suffered a major setback, which had not yet occurred. And when might a real American victory come? When the men and weapons could get down to Halsey. At the moment, the old battleships were still stationed at Pearl as a last line of defence against possible Japanese landings there. Task Force 11 was at Pearl, and could be sent south in mid-November when the repairs to Saratoga and North Carolina were finished. Task Force 17 was finished. The force had been broken up on the loss of Hornet and injury to South Dakota. Task Force 16 was not ready for battle, and would not be until Enterprise was repaired. What Halsey had then, besides unlimited courage, was a force of cruisers and destroyers, the battleship Washington, and Admiral Fitch's land-based airplanes with which to fight. There were also 24 submarines available. There could be no offensive until more planes came down, until Henderson Field was ready for all-weather operation, and supporting fields were built. On the island, the Marines were tired and needed to be pulled out, but this could not happen until reinforcements could be brought in, which would probably not be in November. So the same problems existed that had existed before Halsey arrived, with one great difference. The situation was critical, said Nimitz, but the determination, efficiency, and morale of our people there is so fine that even the most pessimistic critics must concede that we will win out in the end. There it was. Halsey's infectious grin and tough words had reached even back to Pearl. It was no accident that Halsey was building morale, and building it fast. Before the ships damaged in the Battle of Santa Cruz arrived back at Noumea, Halsey had called in the senior officers of all branches of the services and directed them to pool their forces. Our shoestring had held, but it had been badly frayed and it had to be patched up. Halsey then headed for Guadalcanal, where he held his famous press conference and then visited the hospital at Ep.5. The word got around. The boys on Guadalcanal had a boss who cared. The word was slower getting home, because the correspondence stories had to go back to Pearl Harbor or Washington for censorship and transmission home. Secretary Knox was concerned about this aspect of the war, realizing, as the admirals tended to forget, that the whole nation was involved in this war, and winning it was a job at home as well as in the theatres of operations. Knox asked for, and got, Nimitz's concurrence in handling press copy at Noumea. Knox also wanted to use Navy communications facilities for transmission, but here Nimitz balked. He knew the enemy monitored his radio, and he feared that the sending of press copy would give the enemy a basis for breaking the American codes. In comparison to the Army, the Navy's public relations were rudimentary. King and Nimitz, and even Halsey, considered the press a nuisance. Whether necessary or not depended on the Admiral's point of view at any given moment. But in operations, Halsey was snapping the boys to, as the Marines would say. An example of the manner in which the Americans were learning in this war could be seen in the report and comment of various officers on the fighting of Fighting Squadron 6, which went into action on Guadalcanal in September. Shortly after Halsey took command at Noumea, the commanding officer of Fighting 5, Lieutenant Commander L.C. Simpler, made an operational report which was destined for Nimitz. The squadron of 24 F-4Fs and 24 pilots had come ashore at Guadalcanal to operate with the 1st Marine Air Wing. Later, 8 more pilots had joined up. Between September 11th and October 16th, 2 pilots were known to have been killed in action, 3 others were missing and 4 were wounded. They lost 8 planes from enemy aerial action, 5 planes in operations, and 7 planes because of enemy bombardment of Henderson Field. They destroyed 45 enemy planes and another 6 probables. Here is the way Fighting 5 operated in those hard days. 1 pilot for each operational plane stood by in the ready tent, and the planes were dispersed around the field with the captains standing by as soon as word came of an enemy airstrike headed their way. The guns were charged by the ordnance crew and everything was ready. The commanding officer issued his order, scramble, and the pilots rushed to man their planes, taking off as quickly as possible in no special order. First plane off acted as leader until the assigned leader got into position. Section leaders were assigned, but it was really up to them to take over a 2-plane section, and everyone flew wing from time to time. The climb was made as quickly as possible to 26,000 feet or more. It took 35 to 40 minutes to hit 30,000 feet. The flight leader led the attack then, using the steep high side with full deflection, then coming down to half-deflection aim. The attackers fired just ahead of the enemy planes, letting them fly into the fire. If they were attacking Mitsubishi Navy bombers, they aimed just behind either engine, hoping to flame one. After attacking, each plane joined up on the first fighter in sight for mutual protection. When escorting, the pilots learned to keep together, never to be diverted by a chance to strafe a surface craft, and to stick with the bombers all the way. On strafing missions, they had learned to make a steep sweeping dive from 10,000 to 12,000 feet against any ship that could put up a heavy barrage of anti-aircraft fire. With each plane's attack, they discovered, the fire from a ship like a cruiser would decrease. No sweeping. The pilots were to pick out a fixed point and aim at it. The flyers of Fighting 5 were proud of their strafing record. In many attacks they had still not lost a plane. They had learned about men as well as flying. Commander Simpler said they needed 2 pilots for every plane, pilot relief every 2 weeks, more often during heavy action. A pilot was as good as his physical condition, and one exposed to too much combat might be out of the war for good. Older pilots were as good as younger ones, and even better as flight leaders. A pilot's offensive spirit was measurable directly in relationship to his equipment. As for fighters generally, a plane should be measured not by the number of Japanese who were shot down, but by the number of Japanese who escaped. And the F-4F had its faults, these pilots said. The rate of climb was too slow, the speed was too much slower than that of the Zero, and their range of the F-4F was too short. That meant that half the Japanese bombing attempts on Guadalcanal made the target because the F-4Fs could not climb fast enough to intercept, and that the Japanese base at Buka was beyond the range of Fighting 5. As for the engine, the Pratt and Whitney 1830-86, the pilots were generally pleased. There were minor problems, but they knew that under combat conditions the planes were abused. Prolonged climbs were made at full horsepower output, with cylinder head and oil temperatures exceeding maximum limits. Dives were made with full throttle and in high blower. Under such conditions, said Fighting Five's commander, the engine life was about 90 hours, but he was not complaining. This, however, usually exceeds that of the plane, he said dryly. One problem was the oxygen equipment. 4 pilots had died under conditions that indicated oxygen failure, and no one knew why. The masks were troublesome and interfered with goggles and with microphones, but they did not know why. One pilot was killed thus who had been up to high altitude several times. One day he checked his oxygen equipment and took off. At 22,000 feet, the flight leader saw his plane maneuvering strangely and called him on the radio. But the pilot did not respond. His plane nosed over and after a long dive crashed into the water. The radio the flight leader used was unreliable for plane-to-plane talk. The throat microphones were a dangerous nuisance. What was needed was a radio giving instant transmission, frequency selection, and positive tuning without giving the pilot much trouble. The guns gave trouble too, but in this the commander indicated one of the problems that Nimitz had already recognized, even as he sent these carrier planes ashore for service. Carrier planes were not fitted for land-based air operations. Maintenance at an advanced base is far more difficult than on a carrier, said Simpler. And what he wanted, if his pilots came ashore to fight, was land fighters. Had P-38S been available at Guadalcanal, at least 80% of all enemy aircraft appearing in the area would have been destroyed. But of course the P-38S just were not available. Operation Shoestring again. Fighting Five's report went to Admiral Fitch first of all. It was written on November 11th, and he got to it on December 1st. He liked and appreciated the report. An excellent presentation of the problems encountered by land plane squadrons shore-based in a combat area. As for operations and tactics, Fitch was satisfied that they were sound. He congratulated Simpler on learning fast and collating the information for others. Fitch noted the sharpness of Japanese tactics and suggested that the use of P-38S would solve many problems. He agreed that each plane should have 2 pilots where the fighting was heavy. Under these conditions, it is necessary to scramble all planes when bombing is imminent, and the physical condition and effectiveness of pilots deteriorate rapidly if they are maintained indefinitely on call. In the future, Fitch warned, the Navy simply had to make adequate provision for ground echelons, including enough mechanics. The situation on Guadalcanal has been far from satisfactory in this respect, and is only now, 3 months after the invasion, showing improvement. Halsey had the report and Fitch's endorsement on December 20th. He too approved of Simpler's succinct report and agreed with Fitch's comments. He noted that more training was needed in aerial gunnery to ready the pilots for the difficulties of full and half-deflection shooting, and that the Japanese shooting had dropped in effectiveness. He recalled for the minds of higher authority that Japanese strafing at Pearl Harbor had been masterly, but at Guadalcanal it was ineffectual. He was concerned about the oxygen matter and about the radio deficiency, which was already being corrected by supply of push-button sets. Next, the report and the endorsements appeared on the desk of Admiral Towers, who had arrived at Pearl Harbor and begun to function as commander of the Air Force Pacific Fleet. By now it was January 17th. Towers agreed with all that was said, but added his own spice. He lamented the fact that it had been necessary to use Fighting Five ashore at all. The need for trained carrier pilots was such that they should be assigned to carriers. True, at the moment that Towers wrote, it would become every more true as the promised carriers came off the ways and were fitted out for the Pacific War. But in those grim days at Guadalcanal, when Saratoga had been crippled and every man and weapon had been needed, it was much more sensible to send Fighting Five ashore than to return the squadron to Pearl Harbor, where the planes would be out of action. On February 22nd, Spruance, the Chief of Staff to Nimitz, had the report and passed it along to Admiral King, agreeing that it was best to keep carrier pilots on carriers. It seems a long time between the writing of Simpler's report and its arrival at King's desk, but the fact was that the people who needed the details were getting them all the way along. Fitch had read about and was fighting for land-based planes and better radio. Halsey had read and was talking about training. Towers was urging the recall of these men to their carrier duty. Spruance and Nimitz were comparing the needs of the moment with the best of plans. The attrition continued in November. After Santa Cruz, Halsey sent the destroyer Smith back to Pearl. She had been hard hit in the last stages of the battle, but was still going. The Mahan had also been hurt, much of her bow torn away, but she could be repaired in Australia, as could the San Juan, the anti-aircraft cruiser, which had taken an armour-piercing bomb. Enterprise was under local repair, and on November 6th, Halsey had her ready for sea on 36 hours' notice, capable of operating 69 planes.